Antarctica is the far southern continent of the Earth, forlorn to mankind by its remarkable isolation and unimaginable cold climate. By chance, the ancient Greeks predicted the existence of a large southern continent that would serve to balance the large northern one that was the Old World. Meanwhile, the ancient seafaring Polynesians, raised by the sea of the surrounding continent around 650 AD, perhaps even venturing onto the landmass itself. Still, it would be another 1,000 years before European navigators and sealers began to venture into the Antarctic Circle.
During the 1600s and 1700s, explorers gradually began to discover the islands hovering above and in the vicinity of the continent. The famed Brit, James Cook, pondered down into the Antarctic Circle in the 1770s, and by the 1820s, the first reports emerged from the sailors that claimed to have seen or have set foot upon the mainland itself.
Throughout the rest of the 1800s, more explorers, often sealers or whalers hunting for their respective game, charred more and more of the continent's shores. By the late 1890s, a new wave of exploration began in Antarctica, as the allure of discovery came to motivate many of the new sailors from across the world to seek fame and honor by pioneering into the interior of the Earth's last frontiers. It is into the era, the golden era of Antarctic exploration, that we may immerse ourselves in the story of two teams, one from Norway, the other from Great Britain, that vied to be the first humans in history to set foot upon the South Pole.
The two teams that vied to be the first humans to reach the South Pole were each headed by two rugged and exceptional individuals. The Norwegian team was headed by a man named Roald Amundsen. Amundsen was a dedicated sailor whose experience was acquired while serving on a sealing vessel in the Arctic.
Galvanized by the American Robert Peary reaching the North Pole in 1909, Amundsen decided that he would take a bid to be the first one to reach the South Pole instead.
The decision to go to the South Pole was kept strictly secret from the public, and even from crew members of his own ship, only being revealed to them as their ship rounded Cape Horn in South America. The British expedition, meanwhile, was led by an experienced Robert Falcon Scott, born in Devon as the son of a brewer. Having been in the Royal Navy since the age of 13, Scott was an experienced officer and explorer that had already been on an Antarctic expedition about a decade earlier aboard the Discovery from 1901 to 1904. Scott had a deep interest in the scientific aspects of the Antarctic, such as the zoology, meteorology, and geology of the continent. And besides reaching the pole, first Scott hoped to learn more information by bringing with him several scientific experts. There were several differences between the Norwegian and British teams, both in terms of their equipment and their strategies.
One notable difference between the Norwegians and the Brits were in the usage of dog teams.
Whereas the Norwegians relied heavily upon using canines to assist in hauling their sleds across the continent, Scott instead relied upon using ponies and 3 motorized sledges for his journey. These sources of transportation were new, experimental, and rather untested on the unprecedented endeavor that the men were going to endure. In addition, the Norwegians' navigational technology and capabilities were quite ahead of those of the Brits. Amundsen was also inspired by his time with the Inuits of the Arctic, deciding for his crew to use fur clothes rather than the traditional source of cotton that Scott's team would be using. The Norwegian expedition finally departed Norway on the 15th of August 1910, beginning a 4-month journey aboard the polar vessel Fram, whose name means forward in Norwegian. The Fram would depart from Kristiansand with 97 dogs, 400 bundles of dried fish, skis, and sledge equipment. Before getting to Antarctica, the crew made a quick stop at Madeira on September 6th of that year, adding several more huskies to their dog team. This allowed the crew to receive some final letters from their families, a small boon of joy to the crew. The voyage south took about 4 months, and the team reached the Bay of Whales in Antarctica on January 14th. They would establish a base there called Framheim, literally meaning the home of their ship, the Fram. Whilst this was going on, the British expedition was held upon their own vessel, Terra Nova, meaning the new land in Latin. It departed on the 15th of June 1910 from the Welsh port city of Cardiff. While traveling to Antarctica, their ship would hit a storm that resulted in the loss of some of their ponies, dogs, and coal. By December 8, 1910, the crew spotted their first iceberg, and next day the Terra Nova was in the ice packs of Antarctica. Over the next 3 weeks, the ship would battle through thick pack ice, but by December 30th, the Terra Nova had gone through the worst of it. On New Year's Day, Mount Erebus came into view, and the crew would soon anchor to the ice on McMurdo Sound by Cape Evans. One of the initial tasks that Amundsen sought to accomplish was setting up supply depots on the expedition's route to and from the South Pole. On this, Amundsen wrote that he had decided that
4 men should bring ashore the little that remained, while the other 4 went southward to latitude 80 degrees south, partly to explore the immediate neighborhood and partly to begin the transport of provisions to the south.
the first expedition to set up these depots went out on February 10th, and by mid-April they spread out around 3,000 kilograms of resources to 3 depots. The winter would pass with little issue, and in September the sun once again ascended out of the bleak horizon. Despite having to turn back once due to weather reaching negative 55 degrees Celsius, Amundsen's team recouped their bearings and on October 20th decisively set off southward towards the pole. Meanwhile, on January 4th, 1911, the British crew started to unload all of their materials, ponies, and sledges at Cape Evans. The crew established 25 by 25 foot living quarters over the next 2 weeks, insulated with kilted sea leaf lined with matchboard. By this time, the crew learned that Amundsen arrived at the Bay of Whales, which was 70 miles closer to the pole than they. The British also set up supply depots along much of the route that the core team of explorers would be taking, and on November 1st, 1911, Captain Scott and 4 other of his men, Captain Oates, Dr. Wilson, Lieutenant Bowers, and Petty Officer Evans, left for the pole. The Norwegian team reached the North Pole at 3 p.m. on the 14th of December 1911, raising their nation's flag at the site. Amundsen was ecstatic, and yet took humor at his circumstances.
I had better be honest and admit straight out that I have never known any man to be placed in such a diametrically opposite position to the goal of his desires as I was at that moment. The regions around the North Pole, well, yes, the North Pole itself, had attracted me from childhood, and here I was at the South Pole. Can anything more topsy-turvy be imagined?
Of course, due to the constraints of communication of the time, this was known to nobody besides Amundsen's team at first, not even the Scott. The crew would spend 3 days in the area taking measurements and going on ski trips to make sure they covered the invisible point. Amundsen left their flag-bearing tent along with a letter to Scott at the pole, should he and his team perish on their way back. The world would still know that Amundsen was the first to reach the South Pole. Amundsen's crew did not perish, and on January 26, 1912, Amundsen and all of his team safely returned to their base at Framheim, having trekked about 3,000 kilometers on their journey. Scott and the British would arrive a month after Amundsen, on the 17th of January 1912, to the crushing sight of a Norwegian flag posted upon a tent. Scott expressed his disappointment in a somberly droll remark written upon reaching the pole.
Well, we have turned our back now on the goal of our ambition, and must face our 800 miles of solid dragging. And goodbye to most of the daydreams.
Scott had achieved his dream by reaching the pole, yet the triumph was a somber one indeed. Now the real question would be how the team would return to their base at McMurdo Sound. The weather hindered their progress to about 5 miles a day. As each day passed, the tortures of fatigue and frostbite intensified upon each man. Evans, riddled with frostbite, died during the night of February 17th, with Oates soon also succumbing to the elements and sacrificing himself for the remainder of his companions. The remaining 3 men were dangerously low on food, and after passing one of their supply depots, they could barely spare a little more energy. Scott, along with his 2 remaining men, Bowers and Wilson, would die on the 29th of March 1912 in their tent, famished, frostbitten, exhausted of life, a mere 11 miles from a supply depot. It was on this day that Scott would pen some of his last frantic, aching words.
We shall stick it out to the end, but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think that I can write more.
Months later, during the next Antarctic summer, a search party found their bodies and erected a cairn in their honor upon the site at which they fell. The conquest of the South Pole by Amundsen reached the mainstream world on March 7, 1912, when the Fram reached port in Hobart, Australia, and spread by telegram worldwide. The Norwegian triumph was greeted with congratulations across the world, even in Britain, where the Norwegians' accomplishment was acknowledged respectfully, albeit a little bit bitterly.
The news of the death of Scott and his team had hit Great Britain hard, where he quickly acquired the grieving admiration of the populace.
Commemoration services were organized across the country as people sought to recognize and remember their nation's fallen hero. Today, Scott and his tragically stoic story have been immortalized through his final diary writings, which even today are hailed as excellent pieces of literature. Though he came second in his race, his efforts and virtues are to be known for time immemorial.
Had we lived, I should have had a tale to tell of the hardihood, endurance, and courage of my companions, which would have stirred the heart of every Englishman. These rough notes and our dead bodies must tell the tale, but surely, a great rich country like ours will see that those who are dependent on us are properly provided for.